You've wasted enough time. No more excuses. In the next few hours, you'll learn how to destroy procrastination forever. The Procrastination Solution. Audiobook by Rowan March, published by Inner Impact Books. Introduction. You know the feeling, that heavy weight in your chest when you look at your unfinished projects, the gnawing anxiety as deadlines loom closer, the crushing disappointment when another day slips by without progress. You've tried everything: productivity apps, morning routines, accountability partners, yet here you are, still stuck in the same pattern of delay and regret. But what if I told you that procrastination isn't your fault? What if those endless cycles of putting things off weren't because you're lazy, unmotivated, or lacking discipline? The truth is, procrastination is a symptom, not the disease. It's your brain's automatic response to deeper psychological triggers that have been programmed into your neural pathways over years of unconscious conditioning. Think about it. Every time you've told yourself, "I'll start tomorrow," every instance you've waited for the perfect moment, every occasion you've chosen short-term comfort over long-term progress, you weren't making a conscious choice. You were running an outdated mental software that prioritizes immediate emotional relief over meaningful action. This audiobook will show you how to rewrite that code. Not through superficial time management techniques or motivational pep talks, but by rewiring the fundamental patterns in your brain that drive procrastination. You'll discover why willpower always fails you and what to use instead, how to transform paralyzing perfectionism into purposeful action, and the exact steps to build an unstoppable action-taking mindset. This isn't just another self-help book. It's a complete reprogramming of your relationship with action and achievement. Chapter 1. The Hidden Traps of Procrastination. You sit down, ready to start. You know what needs to be done. But instead of diving in, you check your phone, get up for coffee, or convince yourself you need to get in the right headspace. Sound familiar? The task sits there, waiting, while you find increasingly creative ways to avoid it. Each minute that passes adds another layer of anxiety, yet you keep finding reasons to delay. This isn't about poor time management or lack of motivation. What you're experiencing is far more complex. An invisible force that hijacks your best intentions and redirects your energy toward anything but the task at hand. Until you understand what's really driving this behavior, you'll remain trapped in an endless cycle of avoidance, guilt, and last-minute panic. The truth about procrastination runs deeper than most realize. It's not a character flaw or moral failing. It's a sophisticated psychological defense mechanism your brain has developed to shield you from perceived threats. These threats aren't physical, they're emotional. Fear of failure, fear of success, perfectionism, overwhelm. Your mind has learned to associate certain tasks with potential discomfort, and in its misguided attempt to protect you, it steers you toward temporary relief instead of meaningful progress. Take Steve Jobs, for instance. While history remembers him as a visionary who transformed multiple industries, few know about his intense struggles with procrastination during Apple's early days. The pressure to innovate and the weight of expectations often left him paralyzed. But Jobs didn't overcome this through sheer willpower or by implementing another productivity system. Instead, he learned to recognize and outmaneuver his psychological barriers. When faced with a challenging decision or project, Jobs would break it down to its core elements, stripping away the emotional weight that triggered his avoidance. He developed what he called deciding points, clear moments of action that made progress inevitable. By understanding that his procrastination stemmed from perfectionism and fear of criticism, he could address these root causes rather than battle with surface-level symptoms. This revelation transforms how you can approach your own procrastination. Think about a project or goal you've been putting off. When you examine it closely, Is it really about not having enough time or energy? Or is something deeper at play? Your brain has become expertly skilled at generating plausible-sounding excuses, but these are merely smokescreens hiding the real barriers to action. Consider Ethan, a talented web designer who spent months preparing to launch his freelance business. He told himself and others that he needed to perfect his portfolio, fine-tune his business plan, and wait for the right market conditions. But beneath these rational-sounding delays lay a paralyzing fear of failure. The thought of putting himself out there and potentially facing rejection kept him trapped in an endless cycle of preparation. The breakthrough came when Ethan finally acknowledged his true barrier. It wasn't about having the perfect plan. It was about facing his fear of judgment. Once he recognized this, he could stop using preparation as a shield and start taking meaningful action. He launched his business with an imperfect portfolio and learned that the real growth came from engaging with actual clients, not from endless refinement in isolation. Your path forward begins with similar honesty. The procrastination holding you back isn't about laziness or lack of capability. It's about the unconscious barriers you've built to avoid emotional discomfort. Only by identifying these hidden traps can you start dismantling them instead of being controlled by them. For the next 24 hours, I challenge you to become a detective of your own behavior. Every time you notice yourself procrastinating, pause and write down exactly what you're avoiding. Then ask yourself, what am I really afraid of? Don't accept your first surface-level answer. Dig deeper. The awareness you gain will become your first step toward breaking free from procrastination's grip. Chapter 2. The Lie of I'll Do It Later. The alarm blares, jolting you awake. You reach for your phone, already thinking about that important project waiting on your desk. I'll tackle it after breakfast, you tell yourself. Breakfast comes and goes. I'll start once I've cleared my inbox. The morning slips away. After lunch, when I have more energy. The afternoon vanishes into a blur of small tasks and distractions. Tomorrow, you finally decide. I'll be more focused tomorrow. But tomorrow never comes, does it? Because tomorrow's version of you faces the exact same battle, armed with the same excuses and emotional barriers. The cycle continues, each day reinforcing the habit of delay, while that nagging voice in your head grows louder. Why can't I just get started? This mental trap, the belief that your future self will somehow be more disciplined, more motivated, or better equipped to handle challenges, is perhaps the most insidious form of self-deception. It's a psychological escape hatch that feels rational in the moment, but leads to a perpetual cycle of postponement and regret. The science behind this phenomenon, known as temporal discounting, reveals something fascinating about how our brains process future events. Research shows that we literally view our future selves as strangers, different people who will magically possess all the qualities we currently lack. This cognitive bias creates a dangerous loop. By constantly deferring action to this idealized future version of yourself, you never develop the very qualities you're waiting for. Take Elon Musk's approach to this challenge during Tesla's early days. When developing the first Tesla Roadster, the company faced seemingly impossible deadlines and technical hurdles. The easy path would have been to delay, to wait until conditions were perfect, or until they had more resources. Instead, Musk implemented what he called temporal compression, deliberately setting aggressive deadlines that forced immediate action. During a particularly crucial phase of development, Tesla's engineering team insisted they needed several more months to perfect the battery management system. Musk's response was unconventional. He announced a public demonstration of the prototype in 6 weeks. This wasn't reckless bravado. It was a deliberate strategy to eliminate the later option. The team, faced with an immovable deadline and public accountability, found creative solutions they might never have discovered if given the luxury of delay. The key insight here isn't about working faster. It's about understanding that waiting for optimal conditions is a form of self-sabotage. Every time you postpone action, you're not just delaying progress. You're actively strengthening the neural pathways that make procrastination your default response. This brings us to the crucial question: how do you break free from this pattern? The answer lies in what psychologists call temporal nearness, making the future consequences feel immediate and personal. Instead of viewing tasks through the lens of your imagined future self, you need to collapse that timeline into the present moment. Take Lena, a medical student who perpetually postponed studying for her board exams. "I work better under pressure," she told herself, imagining that future Lena would somehow embrace the mountain of material she was avoiding. This pattern continued until her study group implemented a daily accountability system. Each morning, they would share their learning objectives for that day, not the week, not the month, just that day. The breakthrough came when Lena realized she didn't need to feel ready to start. By breaking down her study sessions into 25-minute blocks and committing to just one block each morning, she bypassed her brain's resistance to the larger task. That first block often led to more, but the key was removing the option of delay. Within weeks, her study habits transformed from sporadic cramming to consistent progress. This principle extends beyond academic pursuits. Whether you're launching a business, writing a book, or simply tackling your inbox, the mechanism is the same. Your brain will always generate plausible-sounding reasons to wait. The trick isn't to argue with these reasons. It's to make the action threshold so low that procrastination becomes more uncomfortable than taking action. Think about that project you've been putting off. Right now, your mind is probably offering familiar justifications. "I need more preparation. I'll have more energy later. I should wait until I have a clear schedule." These aren't rational assessments. They're comfort-seeking behaviors disguised as planning. The path forward isn't about summoning heroic willpower or waiting for motivation to strike. It's about creating conditions where action becomes inevitable. This means shrinking the initial step until it feels almost trivially small, removing the option of delay through external commitments, making the future consequences feel immediate and personal. When you understand that your future self isn't some upgraded version of you, but rather someone who will face the same struggles and temptations, the illusion of later loses its power. The only version of you that matters is the one hearing these words right now. Chapter 3. The Perfectionism Trap. You tell yourself you're just being thorough, that you want to get it right, that once you find the perfect approach, everything will click. But the truth? Perfectionism is a trap. It disguises itself as ambition, but in reality, it's just a sophisticated form of procrastination that keeps you from ever finishing, or even starting. Right now, there's something you're holding back. A project, a goal, a creation that lives in your mind as this pristine, flawless vision. You can see it so clearly, exactly how it should look, feel, and function. And because reality can never quite match that perfect mental image, you keep tweaking, adjusting, and planning, convinced that just one more revision will bridge the gap between vision and reality. But here's what perfectionism really costs you: time, growth, real-world feedback, the opportunity to learn from mistakes and iterate based on actual experience rather than theoretical scenarios. While you're polishing that first draft for the 100th time, someone else is shipping their good enough version and learning from genuine market response. The psychology behind perfectionism reveals something fascinating. It's not actually about achieving excellence. It's about avoiding vulnerability. When you demand perfection from yourself, you're not pursuing greatness. You're trying to make yourself criticism-proof. But this strategy backfires spectacularly because it keeps you stuck in an endless loop of preparation without execution. Perfectionism operates through a deceptive internal dialogue. It whispers that you're just being professional, that high standards are admirable, that excellence takes time. These sound like virtuous principles, but they're actually fear wearing a mask of quality control. The real message is, if it's not perfect, it's not safe to share. Observe Shonda Rhimes, the creative force behind some of television's most successful shows. Early in her career, she would obsessively rewrite scripts, sometimes staying up all night to tweak dialogue that was already strong. She wasn't making the work better. She was hiding from the vulnerability of letting it be seen. The turning point came when a producer gave her a hard deadline, forcing her to submit a non-perfect script. To her surprise, the feedback wasn't about the minor flaws she'd been agonizing over. It was about the story's emotional impact. This revelation transformed her approach to creativity. She realized that connection trumps perfection every time. "I had to learn that done is better than perfect," Rhimes later shared. "Perfect is the enemy of good. Perfect is the enemy of done. Perfect is the enemy of running your damn business." This insight didn't lower her standards. It freed her to produce consistently excellent work without getting trapped in the perfection spiral. The science of perfectionism reveals an even more insidious pattern. The more you pursue perfection, the more your brain becomes wired for avoidance rather than action. Research shows that every time you step back from sharing or submitting work because it's not quite ready, you strengthen the neural pathways associated with hesitation and self-doubt. This creates a compounding effect where the need for perfection grows stronger over time, while your tolerance for imperfection, and thus your ability to actually complete things, grows weaker. You're literally training your brain to be more perfectionist with each delay. But there's a way out of this trap. And it starts with understanding that perfectionism isn't really about the work. It's about you, your worth, your identity, your fear of judgment. Once you recognize this, you can begin to separate your value as a person from the inevitable imperfections in your work. Take Noah, a talented digital artist who kept delaying his first online portfolio. Every piece needed one more adjustment, one more layer, one more revision. His work was technically impressive, but it wasn't generating any income or building his reputation because no one was seeing it. His breakthrough came through an unexpected challenge from his mentor. Post your worst piece first. This seemingly counterintuitive advice forced Noah to confront his real fear. Not that his work wasn't good enough, but that he wasn't good enough. When he finally shared that imperfect piece, something remarkable happened. People responded to the emotion in the work, the unique perspective, the raw authenticity. They didn't see the flaws he'd been obsessing over. They saw something genuine and compelling. This experience completely shifted Noah's approach. He started sharing work-in-progress shots, embracing the learning process publicly, and building a devoted following who appreciated his journey as much as his finished pieces. Within 6 months, he had more commissioned work than he could handle, all because he stopped waiting for perfection and started embracing progress. The key is to reframe perfectionism not as a quality standard, but as a fear response. When you feel that urge to endlessly refine and revise, ask yourself, am I making this better, or am I making it safer? Usually it's the latter. Here's how to break free. Start with small, low-stakes releases. Share something minor that doesn't feel tied to your core identity. Notice how the world doesn't end when it's not perfect. Set concrete, good enough criteria before you begin. Define what constitutes a shippable product and stick to those standards instead of chasing an ever-moving target of perfection. Create artificial deadlines with real consequences. Tell people when they can expect your work. Make commitments that force you to release before everything feels perfect. Remember, perfection is theoretical. Impact is real. Every day you spend pursuing perfection is a day your work isn't out there making a difference, teaching you lessons, or moving you closer to your goals. Your challenge now is to take something you've been endlessly tweaking, a project, a piece of work, anything you've been holding back because it's not perfect yet, and release it within the next 24 hours. No more changes, no more adjustments, just ship it. This isn't about lowering your standards. It's about raising your commitment to actual achievement over theoretical perfection. Because in the end, a good project that exists will always outperform a perfect project that lives only in your mind. Chapter 4. The Overwhelm Procrastination Loop. You've felt it before. That paralyzing sensation when your to-do list seems to stretch endlessly in every direction. Projects pile up, deadlines loom, and instead of taking action, you find yourself frozen. Your mind races between urgent emails, unfinished presentations, and looming commitments until the weight of it all pushes you toward the path of least resistance, avoidance. But what if I told you that overwhelm isn't really about having too much to do? It's about how your brain processes multiple demands competing for your attention. When faced with too many choices or tasks, your mind enters a state of decision paralysis, a psychological phenomenon where the abundance of options actually decreases your ability to make any choice at all. Think of your brain like a computer with limited processing power. When too many programs run simultaneously, the system slows down and eventually freezes. This is precisely what happens when overwhelm triggers procrastination. Your mental CPU gets overloaded, and rather than risk making the wrong choice about what to tackle first, it chooses to shut down entirely. Tim Cook, Apple's CEO, understands this principle intimately. In a world where he could easily drown in thousands of decisions daily, he maintains remarkable productivity through what he calls ruthless prioritization. Each morning, before the chaos of the day begins, Cook identifies the single most important decision or action that will create the greatest impact. Everything else becomes secondary. During Apple's challenging transition period after Steve Jobs' passing, Cook faced an overwhelming array of responsibilities: managing public expectations, overseeing product development, maintaining company culture, and steering the world's most valuable company. Instead of trying to juggle everything simultaneously, he focused on one critical priority at a time. "There's a lot of noise in the world, and I try to minimize it," Cook explained in a rare interview. "If you believe that innovation is the way forward, then you better be able to focus." This approach helped him navigate Apple through its most significant period of growth, proving that clarity trumps quantity when it comes to execution. The science behind this strategy is fascinating. Study shows that our prefrontal cortex, the brain's command center for complex decision-making, can effectively handle only about 4 variables at once. When we exceed this limit, our mental resources become depleted, triggering what neuroscientists call decision fatigue. This depleted state makes us more likely to procrastinate or make poor choices. But here's where it gets interesting. Studies show that reducing options actually increases productivity and satisfaction with our decisions. When we narrow our focus to fewer choices, we not only make decisions faster, but also feel better about the outcomes. Meet Dylan, a digital marketing executive who was drowning in projects. His desk was a maze of sticky notes. His inbox overflowed with hundreds of unread messages, and his calendar looked like a game of Tetris gone wrong. Every morning he'd arrive at work determined to get everything done, only to end each day feeling further behind. The turning point came when his mentor introduced him to the priority filter technique. Instead of trying to tackle everything at once, Dylan learned to ask himself one simple question: What's the one task that will make everything else easier or unnecessary? This question became his compass. Rather than spreading his energy thin across dozens of tasks, he focused entirely on the highest leverage activity. Some days it meant having a difficult conversation that would unblock multiple projects. Other times it meant completing a key analysis that would inform several decisions downstream. The results were dramatic. Within weeks, Dylan's productivity soared. Not because he was working more hours, but because he stopped letting overwhelm dictate his actions. By focusing on one high-impact task at a time, he created a domino effect where each completed priority made the next tasks simpler or sometimes unnecessary. The key insight from Dylan's transformation is that clarity creates momentum. When you eliminate the mental fog of competing priorities, your brain can fully engage with the task at hand. It's like clearing all the apps running in the background on your phone. Suddenly, everything runs smoother. Now it's your turn to break free from the overwhelmed procrastination loop. Take out your to-do list. Yes, right now. Look at everything you've been avoiding because it feels like too much. Your challenge is to apply the priority filter. Cross off everything except the one task that will create the most impact. That's your only focus until it's done. Chapter 5. Rewiring Your Brain's Resistance. You want to be productive. You tell yourself you'll start soon. But somehow, hours slip away and you're left wondering, why can't I just do the damn thing? The answer lies in your biology. Your brain is designed to avoid effort whenever possible, prioritizing comfort and instant gratification over long-term rewards. If you don't learn how to outsmart it, procrastination will always win. Think about the last time you sat down to work on something important. Within minutes, your hand probably reached for your phone, or your mind wandered to easier, more pleasant activities. This isn't a character flaw. It's your brain doing exactly what it was programmed to do: conserve energy and seek immediate rewards. Your brain evolved during times when conserving energy meant survival. Every calorie saved could mean the difference between life and death. Fast forward to today, and this same survival mechanism is sabotaging your productivity. When faced with a challenging task, your limbic system, the ancient part of your brain responsible for emotions and survival instincts, takes control. It doesn't care about your goals or deadlines. It only wants to minimize discomfort and maximize pleasure. This is where the science gets fascinating. Neuroscientists have discovered that procrastination activates the same reward pathways as addictive behaviors. When you choose the immediate gratification of scrolling social media over working on your project, your brain releases dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter that reinforces pleasure-seeking behavior. Each time you give in to procrastination, you strengthen these neural pathways, making it harder to resist the next time. But here's the game-changing insight. These neural pathways aren't fixed. Your brain is constantly rewiring itself through a process called neuroplasticity. This means you can literally reshape your brain's response to work and effort. Serena Williams, arguably the greatest tennis player of all time, understands this principle intimately. Early in her career, she struggled with maintaining focus during long practice sessions. Her brain, like everyone else's, was wired to avoid sustained effort. But instead of fighting this tendency, she worked with it. Williams developed a training routine that gradually increased in intensity and duration. She started with shorter, high-intensity intervals that gave her brain quick wins and dopamine hits. Over time, she extended these periods, essentially rewiring her brain to associate effort with reward. Today, she can maintain laser focus through grueling 5-hour practice sessions, not because she has superhuman willpower, but because she reprogrammed her brain's response to effort. The science behind this transformation is clear. Research in neuropsychology shows that when we consistently pair effort with reward, we create new neural pathways that override our default tendency to procrastinate. It's like creating a new highway in your brain that bypasses the old, procrastination-prone routes. But here's what most people get wrong. They try to force themselves to focus through sheer willpower. This approach is doomed to fail because it works against your brain's natural mechanisms rather than with them. The key is to work with your brain's reward system, not against it. This means creating what neuroscientists call reward stacking, combining challenging tasks with immediate positive reinforcement. When you do this consistently, your brain starts to associate work with pleasure rather than pain. This brings us to Ava, a coder who struggled with deep work. Like many professionals in the digital age, her brain had become conditioned to crave the quick dopamine hits from social media and instant messaging. Every time she tried to focus on complex coding problems, her mind would wander to her phone, seeking that familiar rush of digital stimulation. The turning point came when Ava learned about dopamine redirection. Instead of trying to suppress her brain's craving for stimulation, she channeled it differently. Before starting her coding sessions, she would do something briefly stimulating but productive, like taking a cold shower or doing a set of explosive jumping jacks. These activities provided the dopamine hit her brain craved, while simultaneously activating her nervous system for focused work. The cold shower, in particular, triggered the release of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter that enhances alertness and concentration. Ava created a simple ritual: 30 seconds of cold water, followed immediately by sitting down at her workspace. No checking phones, no warming up with email. The cold exposure became her brain's new cue for focused work. Within weeks, she noticed a dramatic shift. Her mind stopped resisting deep work because it had formed a new association: the discomfort of cold water, followed by the satisfaction of solving complex problems. This wasn't just a psychological trick. She was literally rewiring her brain's reward circuitry. The same dopamine pathways that once pulled her toward procrastination now pushed her toward action. The key was consistency. She never skipped the cold shower, even on days when she didn't feel like it. But dopamine redirection isn't limited to cold exposure. The principle works with any brief, stimulating activity that you can consistently pair with focused work. Some high performers use quick exercises like burpees or sprints. Others use breathing techniques or power poses. The specific activity matters less than the consistency of the pairing. The science behind this approach is rooted in classical conditioning, the same principle that made Pavlov's dogs salivate at the sound of a bell. When you repeatedly pair a challenging task, like focused work, with a stimulating activity that naturally releases dopamine, your brain starts to associate the two. Over time, the very thought of working triggers a positive response rather than resistance. This rewiring process happens faster than you might think. Studies in neuroplasticity show that new neural pathways can begin forming within days of consistent practice. The key is to maintain the pattern long enough for these pathways to become your brain's default response. But here's the crucial part: you must start immediately. Every time you give in to procrastination, you strengthen the old neural pathways that lead to avoidance. The longer you wait, the harder it becomes to create new ones. Chapter 6: Becoming the Action Taker. If you see yourself as a procrastinator, you'll always procrastinate. This isn't just positive thinking, it's neuroscience. Your brain creates neural pathways that align with your self-image, automatically steering your behavior toward whatever identity you've accepted as true. When you tell yourself, "I'm just not good at following through," or "I always leave things to the last minute," you're not describing your reality, you're creating it. But what if you weren't a procrastinator anymore? What if, starting today, you became someone who takes immediate action without internal debate or delay? This transformation isn't about forcing new habits or struggling against your nature. It's about becoming the kind of person who naturally, effortlessly does what needs to be done. Every single action you take is casting a vote for the type of person you believe yourself to be. When you hit snooze instead of starting your morning routine, you're not just making a one-time choice. You're reinforcing an identity of someone who avoids discomfort. When you choose Netflix over working on your side project, you're strengthening neural pathways that confirm your self-image as someone who lacks follow-through. This is where Michael Jordan's legendary work ethic becomes particularly instructive. Early in his career, Jordan made a decisive identity shift. He didn't just practice more than others, he fundamentally saw himself as someone who never cuts corners. During team practices, when other players would ease up during conditioning drills, Jordan would push harder. When teammates finished their post-practice shooting routines, he'd stay for an extra hour. But here's what most people miss about Jordan's story. His relentless work ethic wasn't the cause of his success. It was the result of his identity. He didn't have to force himself to practice harder or stay longer. These actions flowed naturally from his self-image as someone who never settles for less than his absolute best. His behavior wasn't driven by discipline or motivation. It was simply him being congruent with who he believed himself to be. The science behind this is fascinating. Research in neuroplasticity shows that our brains physically reshape themselves based on our self-concept. When you consistently think of yourself in a certain way, you strengthen neural pathways that support that identity. This means that changing your habits isn't primarily about willpower or techniques. It's about rewiring your brain's fundamental understanding of who you are. Consider Liam, a talented writer who had been struggling to complete his first novel for over 2 years. His problem wasn't lack of skill or time. It was his deep-seated belief that he was someone who struggles with finishing things. This identity created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Whenever he sat down to write, his brain would present him with perfectly logical reasons to stop, all aligned with his self-image as someone who couldn't follow through. The turning point came when Liam realized he was approaching the problem backward. Instead of trying to force himself to write more, he began consciously shifting his identity. Every morning, he would look in the mirror and say with conviction, "I am a writer who finishes what he starts." At first, it felt artificial, even laughable. But he persisted, backing up this new identity with small, consistent actions. He started with tiny commitments, writing just 50 words each day. The goal wasn't the word count. It was proving to himself that he was someone who showed up reliably. Each completed session, no matter how small, cast a vote for his new identity. As these small wins accumulated, something remarkable happened. His brain began accepting this new self-image as truth. Within weeks, Liam noticed that sitting down to write no longer required the same mental battle. It wasn't that the work became easier. He had simply become someone who writes, regardless of mood or circumstance. His actions flowed naturally from his new identity, rather than fighting against his old one. The key insight here is that your brain resists change when it feels inauthentic to who you believe yourself to be. You can have the best productivity system in the world, but if it doesn't align with your self-image, your subconscious mind will sabotage your efforts every time. This is why most attempts to break procrastination through sheer willpower ultimately fail. They don't address the underlying identity driving the behavior. Here's your challenge. Instead of saying, "I need to stop procrastinating," shift your self-talk to, "I am the kind of person who takes action immediately." Write it down, repeat it daily, and let your behavior catch up to your new identity. Chapter 7. The 3-Minute Revolution. Picture yourself staring at that project you've been avoiding. Maybe it's a presentation that needs work, a cluttered garage begging to be organized, or that side business idea you keep pushing off. The mere thought of tackling it makes your stomach tighten. You can feel the weight of it. All those hours of work ahead, all that effort required. But what if I told you that the mountain in front of you is actually just a mental mirage? Your brain is playing a trick on you. When you look at a task in its entirety, your mind automatically calculates all the energy, time, and potential discomfort involved. It's like looking up at Mount Everest from base camp. The sheer magnitude triggers an instinctive resistance. But here's what's fascinating. You don't have to climb the whole mountain at once. You just need to take the first step. The science behind this is compelling. Your brain processes large tasks as potential threats, triggering what neuroscientists call the behavioral inhibition system. This ancient survival mechanism activates whenever we face something challenging or uncertain. It's designed to keep us safe, but in modern life, it often keeps us stuck. Richard Branson's approach to building the Virgin Empire provides a masterclass in overcoming this mental barrier. When asked about starting new ventures, Branson revealed that he never waits until he feels ready or has everything figured out. Instead, he commits to small, decisive actions that build momentum. When launching Virgin Atlantic, he didn't try to comprehend the entire complexity of running an airline. He made one phone call to Boeing about leasing a plane. That single action created forward motion that eventually led to a multi-billion-dollar airline. But Branson's success isn't just about being bold. It's about understanding how the human brain operates. He intuitively grasped what psychologists now call the Zeigarnik effect. Once we start something, our brain develops an almost irresistible urge to complete it. This psychological principle, discovered by Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, explains why unfinished tasks create mental tension that can only be relieved by completion. Think about the last time you started watching a compelling TV series. Even though you meant to watch just one episode, you found yourself clicking next episode again and again. That's the Zeigarnik effect in action. Your brain craves closure once it's engaged with something. The key insight here is revolutionary in its simplicity. The hardest part isn't continuing, it's starting. Your brain will fight you tooth and nail before beginning a task, but once you're in motion, that same brain will actually push you to continue. This is where the 3-minute rule comes in. By committing to just 3 minutes of work, an amount so small it seems almost laughable, you bypass your brain's threat detection system. 3 minutes doesn't trigger resistance. 3 minutes doesn't feel overwhelming. 3 minutes is safe. Consider Zoe, a graduate student who had been paralyzed by the thought of writing her thesis. Every time she sat down to work, her mind would flood with thoughts about the hundreds of pages she needed to write, the months of research required, and the complexity of her topic. This overwhelming perspective kept her stuck in a cycle of avoidance. The turning point came when she discovered the 3-minute rule. Instead of thinking about writing her thesis, she committed to writing for just 3 minutes. No pressure, no expectations, just 3 minutes of putting words on paper. Something fascinating happened. Most days, once those 3 minutes were up, she naturally wanted to continue. The hardest part, starting, was behind her, and momentum carried her forward. Within weeks, she had developed a consistent writing practice. Not because she forced herself to write for hours, but because she made starting so easy that her brain couldn't conjure up excuses. Some days she did only write for 3 minutes, and that was perfectly fine. But more often than not, those 3 minutes expanded into productive writing sessions that gradually brought her thesis to completion. The beauty of this approach lies in its psychological sophistication. When you commit to just 3 minutes, you remove the weight of expectation. There's no pressure to achieve anything significant. You're not trying to finish the project or even make meaningful progress. You're just dipping your toe in the water. But here's what happens. Once you start, several powerful psychological principles kick in. First, the Zeigarnik effect creates an internal pull to continue. Second, you experience what psychologists call task initiation momentum, the tendency for work to feel easier once you've begun. Third, you break through what productivity experts call activation energy, the initial resistance that prevents you from starting. This isn't just about tricking yourself into doing more work. It's about fundamentally changing your relationship with taking action. When you consistently prove to yourself that starting isn't painful, that it's actually quite manageable, you begin to rewire your brain's associations with work. Think about it. How many times have you finally started something you've been avoiding, only to think, why did I make such a big deal out of this? That's because your brain's prediction of how difficult or unpleasant something will be is often wildly inaccurate. The 3-minute rule helps you bypass these faulty predictions and discover the truth through direct experience. The applications of this principle are virtually limitless. Want to start exercising? Commit to 3 minutes of movement. Need to clean your house? Set a timer for 3 minutes in one room. Have a big report to write? Open the document and write for just 3 minutes. Remember, this isn't about finishing in 3 minutes. It's about making starting so easy that procrastination loses its power. Some days you'll do just 3 minutes, and that's a win. You're building the habit of taking action rather than avoiding it. Other days, you'll find yourself naturally continuing well past the 3-minute mark, riding the wave of momentum you've created. The key is to remove all pressure about what happens after those 3 minutes. Don't think about the end goal. Don't worry about how much you should do. Just commit to 3 minutes, and let whatever happens after that unfold naturally. Your challenge for today is simple but powerful. Take that one thing you've been avoiding, you know exactly what it is, and commit to working on it for just 3 minutes. Set a timer, remove all distractions, and begin. Remember, you have full permission to stop after 3 minutes. But don't be surprised if you find yourself wanting to continue. Chapter 8. The Momentum Myth. What if I told you motivation is a myth? That the people who get things done don't rely on feeling like it. They rely on something far more powerful? The truth is, motivation is fleeting, unreliable, and completely unnecessary. The key to long-term productivity isn't motivation, it's momentum. When you wait for motivation, you're essentially gambling with your success. You're betting that some magical feeling will sweep over you and suddenly make difficult tasks easy. But here's the reality. That feeling rarely comes, and even when it does, it vanishes at the first sign of resistance. Think about the last time you felt genuinely motivated. Maybe it was New Year's Day, or after watching an inspiring video, or during a particularly energetic morning. How long did that motivation last? A few hours? A day? This isn't a personal failure. It's human nature. Motivation is an emotion, and like all emotions, it fluctuates wildly based on countless factors. Your sleep, stress levels, blood sugar, the weather, or even a random comment that affected your mood. The real problem isn't your lack of motivation, it's your reliance on it. Every time you tell yourself, I'll do it when I feel ready, or I need to get motivated first, you're reinforcing a dangerous pattern. You're training your brain to believe that action requires a specific emotional state, when in reality, the most successful people in the world have figured out something far more powerful: momentum. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson exemplifies this principle perfectly. In numerous interviews, he's admitted that he doesn't always wake up feeling motivated to hit the gym at 4 a.m. But here's what sets him apart. He doesn't care how he feels. He knows that momentum, not motivation, drives success. Johnson has built an empire on the principle of consistent action, regardless of emotional state. His famous Iron Paradise workouts happen whether he's exhausted from filming, dealing with personal challenges, or simply not in the mood. This isn't about superhuman discipline. It's about understanding a fundamental truth about human psychology. When you take action consistently, Regardless of how you feel, you create what psychologists call behavioral momentum. This phenomenon, first identified in the 1980s, shows that past behavior is the strongest predictor of future behavior. In other words, the more you do something, the easier it becomes to keep doing it. Think of it like pushing a heavy boulder. The initial push requires enormous effort, but once it's rolling, it takes far less energy to keep it moving. This is why waiting for motivation is so counterproductive. You're focusing on the hardest part, the initial push, instead of building the momentum that makes everything easier. Leo, a freelance designer in Chicago, learned this lesson the hard way. For years, he struggled with inconsistent productivity, waiting for creative inspiration to strike before starting his work. Some days, when motivation was high, he'd create brilliant designs for hours. But other days, most days, he'd sit at his computer, scrolling through Instagram for inspiration, waiting for that elusive feeling to hit. The turning point came when a mentor challenged him to abandon motivation altogether. Instead of waiting to feel creative, Leo committed to designing one small thing every day, even if it was just a simple icon or a color palette. The first few days felt forced and uncomfortable. His work wasn't particularly inspired, and every minute felt like a struggle. But something interesting happened around day 5. The act of opening his design software and starting to work became automatic. He stopped questioning whether he felt creative enough. He stopped waiting for inspiration. He just started working, and surprisingly, the creativity began flowing after he was already in motion. Within weeks, Leo's entire relationship with work transformed. His portfolio grew consistently, his clients received work on time, and most importantly, his self-image shifted from struggling creative to professional designer. Not because he found some secret wellspring of motivation, but because he built unstoppable momentum through consistent action. The science behind this transformation is fascinating. Research shows that repeated actions create stronger neural pathways, making those actions increasingly automatic over time. It's like wearing a path through a field. The more you walk it, the clearer and easier to follow it becomes. This explains why relying on motivation is so ineffective. When you wait to feel motivated, you're essentially hoping for an emotional override of your existing neural pathways. But emotions are temporary, while pathways built through consistent action are lasting. The key is to start so small that motivation becomes irrelevant. Instead of waiting to feel like working out for an hour, commit to putting on your gym clothes. Instead of waiting to feel inspired to write, commit to opening your document and typing one sentence. These tiny actions might seem insignificant, but they serve a crucial purpose. They initiate momentum. Once momentum takes over, continuing becomes easier than stopping. This isn't just psychological, it's rooted in physics. Newton's first law of motion states that an object in motion tends to stay in motion. Your productivity works the same way. Your challenge for today is simple but powerful. Pick one task you've been avoiding and commit to doing a tiny part of it every day for the next week. Don't focus on quality or quantity. Just focus on consistency. Watch how momentum takes over and transforms resistance into flow. Chapter 9. Making Action Inevitable. Imagine you're holding two doors, one labeled procrastination and the other action. If one is heavy and rusted while the other glides open effortlessly, which one will you choose? The key to destroying procrastination isn't discipline, it's making action easier than avoidance. When you design your environment and habits correctly, procrastination becomes the harder choice. Right now, your environment is probably working against you. Your phone sits within arm's reach, notifications enabled. Your workspace is cluttered with distractions. Your important tasks require multiple steps to begin. Every element of friction, no matter how small, pushes you toward the path of avoidance. Your brain operates like water. It naturally flows along the path of least resistance. When distractions are readily available and work requires effort, procrastination isn't just likely, it's inevitable. But what if you could reverse this dynamic? What if you could make productive actions so effortless that avoiding them actually requires more energy? James Clear, author of Atomic Habits, demonstrates this principle masterfully. Instead of relying on willpower to write, he designs his environment to make writing inevitable. His laptop opens directly to a blank document. His phone stays in another room. His desk faces a blank wall instead of a window. Every potential distraction requires deliberate effort, while starting work is as simple as sitting down. This isn't about forcing yourself to focus. It's about making focus the default state. Clear's success isn't built on superhuman discipline. It's built on strategic environmental design. He understands that motivation and willpower are finite resources, but a well-designed environment works 24/7. The science behind this approach is compelling. Study in behavioral psychology shows that we significantly overestimate our ability to resist temptation through willpower alone. A study found that up to 45% of our daily actions aren't decisions at all. They're habits triggered by our environment. When you try to force yourself to work in a distracting environment, you're fighting against your brain's natural tendencies. Think about it. How many times have you sat down to work only to find yourself checking social media real quick? It's not because you lack discipline. It's because opening Instagram takes one tap, while starting your important project requires multiple steps. Your brain, designed to conserve energy, naturally gravitates toward the easier action. But here's where it gets interesting. This same principle can work in your favor. When you design your environment correctly, productive actions become the path of least resistance. Procrastination transforms from an easy escape into an inconvenient detour. Mia, an aspiring novelist in Portland, struggled with this firsthand. Every evening she'd intend to work on her book, but her laptop was buried under papers, her writing software took forever to load, and her desk faced a TV that seemed to beckon her attention. Starting to write required so many small decisions and actions that Netflix's autoplay feature usually won out. The turning point came when she realized she wasn't failing at writing. Her environment was failing her. She transformed her workspace with 3 simple changes. Her laptop now lives permanently on a clean desk. Her writing software stays open and ready. And she implemented a rule that she must write 1 sentence before doing anything else in the evening. These changes might seem minor, but they dramatically altered the effort equation. Starting to write became easier than not writing. Within weeks, her daily word count skyrocketed, not because she suddenly developed iron discipline, but because she removed the friction between intention and action. The beauty of this approach is its sustainability. Unlike motivation, which fluctuates daily, or willpower, which depletes with use, a well-designed environment works consistently and automatically. It's like installing guardrails on your behavior. You can still veer off course if you really want to, but staying on track becomes the default. This principle extends beyond physical environment. Digital workspace matters just as much. If your computer requires 6 clicks to reach your important project, but only 1 to reach YouTube, guess where your brain will naturally drift? The key is to reverse this dynamic. Consider these friction points in your own life. How many steps does it take to start your most important work? What distractions are within arm's reach? What productive actions could you make easier? What unproductive actions could you make harder? The goal isn't to eliminate all distractions. That's neither realistic nor necessary. Instead, aim to make distractions require conscious effort, while making productive actions the path of least resistance. A software developer named Alex applied this principle to his coding practice. He noticed he'd often procrastinate on difficult programming problems by checking email or browsing tech news. Instead of trying to build more willpower, He created two different user profiles on his computer, one for work and one for everything else. His work profile had no email access, no social media, and a blocked internet connection except for essential development resources. His personal profile had everything else. Switching between profiles required logging out and back in, a small but significant friction point that made casual distraction less appealing. The results were immediate. Without the constant temptation of easy distractions, Alex found himself naturally focusing on his code. When he did want to check email or browse the web, he had to make a conscious decision to switch profiles. This small barrier was enough to break the automatic reach for distraction. The key insight here isn't about removing all possible distractions. It's about making productive actions the default choice. When starting work requires less energy than avoiding it, procrastination loses its power. Think of it like a river's flow. You can try to dam it up with willpower, but eventually the pressure will break through. Or you can redirect its course, making it flow naturally in the direction you want. Your environment is the landscape that determines this flow. Your challenge for today is simple but powerful. Identify one task you've been avoiding and ask yourself, how can I make this easier to start? Then make 3 specific changes to your environment that reduce friction between you and action. Remember, the goal isn't to make the task itself easier. It's to make starting easier than avoiding. Chapter 10. Reclaiming your focus from digital distraction. You sit down to work, but within minutes, you check your phone. You don't even think about it. It's automatic. Then, an hour later, you realize you've spiraled into a rabbit hole of notifications, memes, and mindless scrolling. If you've ever wondered why it feels impossible to focus, the answer isn't willpower. It's your brain chemistry. Your ability to concentrate has been hijacked, but the good news is you can take it back. Think about the last time you tried to focus deeply on important work. How long did you last before reaching for your phone? 5 minutes? 10? The urge to check notifications has become so automatic that most of us don't even register the decision anymore. It's as if our hands have a mind of their own, constantly gravitating toward these digital distractions. This isn't just about bad habits or lack of discipline. Your brain has been fundamentally rewired by the constant stream of instant gratification that modern technology provides. Every notification, every like, every new piece of content triggers a tiny burst of dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in addiction. Over time, your brain becomes dependent on these quick hits of pleasure, making it increasingly difficult to focus on tasks that require sustained attention and delayed rewards. The science behind this is fascinating and somewhat terrifying. Research shows that the average person checks their phone 96 times per day. That's once every 10 minutes of waking life. Each check creates a small dopamine release, training your brain to crave these interruptions. It's like having a slot machine in your pocket, constantly beckoning for another pull of the lever. Jack Dorsey, co-founder of Twitter, recognized this problem even as his platform contributed to it. Despite, or perhaps because of, creating one of the world's most addictive social media platforms, Dorsey practices extreme measures to protect his own focus. He regularly undertakes extended periods of dopamine fasting, eliminating all non-essential technology use, sometimes for days at a time. During one particularly challenging product development phase at Twitter, Dorsey noticed his ability to think deeply was diminishing. His solution wasn't to work longer hours or drink more coffee. It was to dramatically reduce his dopamine intake. He turned off all notifications, deleted social media apps from his phone, and committed to long periods of uninterrupted work. The results were transformative. His clarity of thought improved, his decision-making became sharper, and his productivity soared. This isn't just about productivity. It's about reclaiming your brain's natural ability to focus deeply. Before the age of smartphones and infinite scroll, humans were capable of sustained concentration for hours. This capacity hasn't disappeared. It's just been buried under layers of digital distraction and dopamine addiction. The real problem isn't the technology itself. It's how it has conditioned our brains to expect constant stimulation. When you try to focus on deep work, you're not just fighting against distractions. You're fighting against a brain that has been trained to resist sustained effort in favor of quick rewards. Think about how this plays out in your daily life. You start working on an important project, but after a few minutes, discomfort sets in. Your brain, accustomed to constant stimulation, begins to protest. You feel an almost physical urge to check your phone, open a new browser tab, or do anything to escape the monotony of focused work. This isn't weakness. It's your brain's conditioned response to the absence of stimulation. Omar, a college student in his final year, experienced this firsthand. His grades were slipping, not because he wasn't intelligent or hardworking, but because he couldn't maintain focus long enough to absorb complex material. Every study session would devolve into a series of quick phone checks that turned into hour-long distractions. The turning point came when he realized his phone addiction wasn't just a bad habit. It was literally rewiring his brain. He decided to try something radical, a 24-hour dopamine detox. No phone, no social media, no YouTube, no digital entertainment of any kind. Just books, writing materials, and his thoughts. The first few hours were excruciating. His brain screamed for stimulation, and he felt physically uncomfortable. But by the evening, something shifted. The constant need for digital stimulation began to fade. He found himself able to read for longer periods without feeling the urge to check his phone. His mind felt clearer, calmer, more focused. The next day, when he returned to his studies, the difference was dramatic. Not only could he focus for longer periods, but he actually found himself enjoying the process of deep work. The material that had seemed impossibly complex now felt manageable when approached with sustained attention. This transformation wasn't magic. It was neuroscience in action. By temporarily eliminating excessive dopamine triggers, Omar allowed his brain's reward system to reset. Activities that require focus and delayed gratification became more appealing, because his brain was no longer constantly comparing them to the instant highs of digital stimulation. The implications of this are profound. Your ability to focus isn't fixed, it's trainable. But training requires more than just willpower. It requires understanding and working with your brain's reward system, rather than against it. Here's what happens in your brain when you're caught in the dopamine loop. Each notification check provides a small but immediate reward, training your brain to crave these quick hits of pleasure. When you try to focus on work that doesn't provide instant feedback, your brain resists because it's been conditioned to expect immediate rewards. The more you give in to these quick dopamine hits, the harder it becomes to find satisfaction in activities that require patience and sustained effort. But here's the good news. This cycle can be reversed. When you temporarily eliminate excessive dopamine triggers, your brain's baseline reward threshold begins to reset. Activities that seemed boring or difficult become more engaging because your brain isn't constantly comparing them to more stimulating alternatives. The key is understanding that this isn't about permanent deprivation. It's about strategic reset periods that allow your brain to recalibrate. Think of it like fasting. You're not giving up food forever. You're creating a controlled period of abstinence that helps reset your system. The results can be remarkable. Many people who undergo even a brief dopamine detox report improved ability to focus for extended periods, greater enjoyment of simple activities, reduced anxiety and mental chatter, better quality sleep, increased productivity and creativity. The challenge lies not in the complexity of the solution, but in our willingness to temporarily disconnect from the constant stream of digital stimulation. Your brain will resist. That's normal and expected. But the discomfort is temporary, while the benefits can be lasting. Chapter 11. Breaking Decision Paralysis. You've been staring at your to-do list for way too long. You tell yourself you'll figure it out, but instead, you overthink, analyze, and second-guess every option. The tasks blur together as your mind spins through endless possibilities, consequences, and what-ifs. Welcome to decision paralysis, where thinking replaces doing and nothing actually gets done. Each minute spent deliberating drains your mental energy, leaving you more uncertain than when you started. It's not that you can't make decisions, it's that you're trapped in a cycle of overthinking that makes every choice feel monumental. But what if you could trick your brain into deciding immediately? The truth about decision paralysis isn't just psychological, it's biological. Your brain consumes approximately 20% of your body's energy, and complex decision-making demands even more. When faced with multiple choices, your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for executive function, becomes overwhelmed. It's like running too many programs on your computer at once. Everything slows down until you freeze completely. This is where the science gets fascinating. Studies have shown that when people are forced to make decisions under time pressure, they actually make choices that are just as good as, and sometimes better than, those made with extended deliberation. The reason? Your brain has two decision-making systems. A slow, analytical system that weighs every option, and a fast, intuitive system that draws on experience and gut feeling. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, understands this dynamic intimately. In building one of the world's most valuable companies, he developed what he calls the 70% rule. Make decisions when you have 70% of the information you wish you had. Waiting for perfect certainty only leads to missed opportunities and stagnation. During Amazon's early days, Bezos faced a critical decision about expanding beyond books into other product categories. Many advised waiting until the book business was perfected, but Bezos knew that perfect information was impossible. Using his 70% rule, he made the decision to expand, a choice that transformed Amazon from an online bookstore into a global empire. The key insight isn't just about making faster decisions. It's about understanding that most decisions are reversible. Bezos categorizes decisions into Type 1, irreversible, and Type 2, reversible. The vast majority fall into Type 2, yet we often treat them all like Type 1, paralyzing ourselves with unnecessary analysis. This is where the 5-minute deadline becomes your secret weapon. By artificially constraining your decision-making time, you force your brain to bypass its overthinking tendencies and tap into its intuitive wisdom. It's like putting your mind on a shot clock. When time is running out, you stop second-guessing and start acting. Ariel, an aspiring entrepreneur, experienced this transformation firsthand. For weeks, she agonized over launching her business website. The design wasn't perfect. The copy could be better. Maybe she should add more features first. Every day brought new doubts and delays. Finally, frustrated with her own paralysis, she decided to apply the 5-minute deadline. She set a timer for 5 minutes and forced herself to make all outstanding decisions about the website before it went off. The pressure of the deadline cut through her mental fog. Suddenly, choices that had seemed impossible became clear. When the timer beeped, she had not only made the decisions, she had actually launched the site. The result surprised her. Not only did launching immediately create momentum, but she discovered that most of the things she'd been agonizing over didn't matter. Her clients cared more about her business being accessible than perfect. The small imperfections she'd obsessed over were invisible to everyone but her. Like Ariel, you can break free from decision paralysis by embracing speed over perfection. The 5-minute deadline works because it aligns with how your brain naturally makes decisions. Under time pressure, your intuitive system takes over, drawing on your accumulated wisdom rather than getting lost in endless analysis. This doesn't mean making reckless choices. It means recognizing that for most decisions, good enough now is better than perfect later. Your brain will resist at first. It's been trained to believe that more thinking equals better decisions. But with practice, you'll discover that decisive action often leads to better outcomes than endless deliberation. Think about it. How many opportunities have you missed while waiting to make the perfect decision? How much mental energy have you wasted overthinking choices that, in retrospect, weren't that significant? The 5-minute deadline isn't just about making faster decisions. It's about freeing yourself from the paralysis that keeps you stuck. Challenge. The next time you find yourself hesitating over a decision, set a timer for 5 minutes. When the timer goes off, take action, no matter what. Chapter 12. The Power of Momentum Stacking. You're in the middle of a task and you want to stop. Your energy is low, your brain is tired, and you're ready to call it quits. The voice in your head whispers that you've done enough, that you deserve a break, that you can always continue later. It's a familiar moment, the point where resistance meets fatigue, and your resolve begins to crack. But what if you could trick yourself into pushing just a little further, without forcing it? The secret to sustained focus isn't willpower, it's momentum stacking. And once you understand how to harness it, you'll never look at productivity the same way again. Think about the last time you tried to force yourself to keep working when your energy was depleted. How did that go? Probably not great. That's because willpower is like a muscle. It gets tired and needs recovery. But momentum stacking operates on a different principle entirely. Instead of fighting against your brain's natural resistance, it works with your psychology to extend your focus organically. Your brain processes effort in chunks, not continuous streams. When you tell yourself you need to work for another hour, your mind immediately pushes back. But when you focus on just the next small increment, one more paragraph, one more equation, one more rep, something fascinating happens. Your brain doesn't register it as a threat. Kobe Bryant mastered this principle during his legendary training sessions. When fatigue set in and his body screamed to stop, he didn't force himself to push through another hour of practice. Instead, he used what he called the one more technique. Just one more shot, one more drill, one more minute. This micro-commitment approach allowed him to bypass mental resistance and tap into hidden reserves of energy. By the end of his career, these sessions became mythical. Teammates would find him in the gym at 3 a.m., still going strong, not through sheer willpower, but through the power of momentum stacking. The science behind this is fascinating. Research in sports psychology has shown that perceived effort is largely psychological rather than physical. When athletes think they're reaching their limits, they typically still have 40% more capacity in reserve. This 40% rule, first documented in Navy SEAL training, demonstrates how our minds, not our bodies, often set our limitations. But this isn't just about physical performance. The same principle applies to any type of focused work. Your brain operates on what neuroscientists call the conservation principle. It naturally seeks to preserve energy by avoiding sustained effort. However, it can be tricked into extending its effort through small, manageable increments that don't trigger its defense mechanisms. Think of it like climbing a mountain. Looking at the peak from the bottom is overwhelming, but focusing on reaching just the next ledge makes the climb manageable. Once you reach that ledge, you focus on the next one. Before you know it, you're halfway up the mountain without feeling overwhelmed. Jonas, a developer in Seattle, discovered this principle by accident. Like many programmers, he struggled with sustained coding sessions. After a couple of hours, his focus would scatter, and he'd find himself mindlessly browsing the internet instead of working. Traditional productivity advice told him to power through, to force himself to stay focused, but that just led to burnout and frustration. Then he stumbled upon the just one more method. When he felt his attention wavering, instead of trying to commit to another hour of coding, he'd tell himself, just one more line of code. This tiny commitment felt manageable. After writing that line, he'd often find himself thinking, well, I might as well finish this function. One function would lead to another, and before he knew it, he'd worked productively for another hour, without the mental resistance that usually accompanied forced focus. The key to Jonas's success wasn't greater willpower or better time management. It was understanding how to work with his brain's natural rhythms rather than against them. By breaking down his work into micro-commitments, he made continued effort feel effortless. This principle works because it hijacks your brain's momentum bias, the tendency to continue an activity once you're already engaged in it. It's like pushing a boulder. The hardest part is getting it moving. Once it's rolling, it takes relatively little effort to keep it going. But here's the crucial part. Momentum stacking only works if you keep the increments small enough that they don't trigger your brain's resistance. The moment you start thinking too far ahead or trying to force too much additional effort, the technique loses its power. The beauty of momentum stacking is that it's infinitely adaptable. Whether you're writing a report, studying for an exam, or working out, you can always break down the effort into smaller chunks that feel manageable. A writer might commit to just one more sentence. A student might focus on just one more page of reading. An artist might promise themselves just one more brushstroke. These micro-commitments bypass your brain's natural resistance to sustained effort. They feel so small that your mind doesn't bother mounting a defense against them. But each small commitment builds upon the last, creating a compound effect that can extend your productive time far beyond what you thought possible. Think of it like compound interest for your focus. Each small extension of effort not only adds to your total work time, but makes the next extension easier. It's a self-reinforcing cycle that builds both productivity and mental stamina. This isn't about pushing yourself to exhaustion or ignoring your body's genuine need for rest. Instead, it's about learning to distinguish between true fatigue and premature surrender. When you feel like stopping, pause and ask yourself, can I do just one more? Often, you'll find that you can. And that one more leads naturally to another, and another. The next time you feel your focus flagging, don't try to force yourself to keep going through sheer willpower. Instead, make a micro-commitment so small it feels almost laughable. Just one more minute. Just one more problem. Just one more attempt. You'll be surprised at how often that one more turns into many more. Not through force, but through the natural momentum you've created. Challenge. The next time you feel like stopping a task, commit to just one more minute, sentence, or rep. You'll be surprised at how much further you can go. Chapter 13. The Power of Ritual Automation. Think about the things you do every single day without hesitation. Brushing your teeth, drinking coffee, checking your phone. These actions flow seamlessly, requiring no mental debate or internal negotiation. You don't sit there contemplating whether you should brush your teeth or planning the perfect moment to check your messages. You just do it. What if you could harness this same automatic response for the tasks you usually procrastinate on? What if starting your work could feel as natural as reaching for your morning coffee? The secret to eliminating procrastination isn't found in motivation quotes or productivity apps. It lies in understanding how your brain creates automatic behaviors and then deliberately engineering these patterns to work in your favor. When you establish the right rituals, action becomes inevitable, not because you force it, but because you've rewired your neural pathways to execute without resistance. Your brain is a pattern recognition machine that craves predictability. It's constantly looking for ways to conserve energy by automating recurring tasks. This is why you can drive home from work while deep in thought about something else. Your brain has automated the routine. This same mechanism can be harnessed to overcome procrastination, but most people never learn how. Michael Phelps, the most decorated Olympian of all time, understood this principle intuitively. Before every race, he performed the exact same ritual, from the moment he walked onto the pool deck until he dove into the water. This wasn't just superstition, it was strategic neurological programming. By following the same sequence of actions every time, he conditioned his brain and body to enter peak performance mode automatically. When the pressure was highest, he didn't need to rely on motivation or willpower. His ritual triggered execution automatically. The science behind this is fascinating. Research shows that repeated behaviors create stronger neural pathways, making those behaviors easier to initiate and maintain. When you perform an action at the same time, in the same way, your brain begins to anticipate and prepare for it before you even start. This pre-activation of neural pathways reduces the mental energy required to begin, effectively bypassing procrastination. But here's what most people get wrong about rituals. They try to create elaborate routines that are too complex to maintain. The power of a ritual lies not in its complexity, but in its consistency. The simpler the ritual, the more likely you are to stick with it until it becomes automatic. Sophie, a novelist in Portland, struggled for years with procrastination. Every morning she'd sit at her desk intending to write, but would find herself doing everything except actually writing. The more she tried to force herself to start, the stronger her resistance grew. Then she learned about ritual automation. Instead of trying to motivate herself to write, she designed a simple pre-writing ritual. Every morning at 7 a.m. she would brew a specific type of jasmine tea in her favorite blue mug, light a sandalwood candle, play the same 2-minute instrumental song, write exactly one sentence. The brilliance of Sophie's ritual wasn't in any single component, it was in the consistency. By performing these actions in the same order every day, she created a neural pathway that associated this sequence with writing. Within weeks, she noticed something remarkable. The moment she smelled jasmine tea, her brain automatically shifted into writing mode. She no longer had to fight resistance or summon motivation. The ritual triggered execution automatically. The key to ritual automation is understanding that your brain responds to sequences, not isolated actions. When you consistently link a series of small actions to a specific task, those actions become a trigger for performance. It's like creating a mental domino effect. Once you tip the first domino, starting your ritual, the rest fall naturally into place. Think about the task you procrastinate on most. Now imagine having a ritual so ingrained that starting feels as natural as brushing your teeth. This isn't fantasy. It's neuroscience applied strategically to overcome procrastination. Your ritual doesn't need to be elaborate. In fact, simpler is usually better. The goal isn't to create a perfect routine. It's to establish a consistent trigger that signals your brain it's time to execute. This could be as basic as arranging your workspace in a specific way, playing a particular song, taking 3 deep breaths, writing down your first action. The power lies not in what you do, but in doing it the same way every time. Each repetition strengthens the neural pathway until starting becomes automatic. Challenge: design a simple pre-task ritual, a 60-second routine you follow before starting work. Repeat it daily until action feels automatic. Chapter 14: The Art of Finishing. Starting is exciting, the middle is tough, but the real battle? Finishing. How many projects, ideas, or goals have you started, only to abandon them before completion. Think about all the half-written novels, partially completed courses, or business ideas that never fully launched. The truth is, most people don't struggle with starting. They struggle with closing the loop. But if you don't finish, you never win. Your brain is wired for novelty. New beginnings trigger a rush of dopamine, making you feel energized and motivated. But as the initial excitement fades, your brain starts seeking the next hit of newness, leaving a trail of unfinished projects in its wake. This isn't just about discipline or commitment. It's about understanding and rewiring your brain's natural tendency to chase novelty over completion. Think about your own pattern. How many times have you reached the 80% mark on a project, only to find yourself mysteriously drawn to start something new? This isn't coincidence or lack of willpower. It's your brain's inherent bias toward novelty over closure. But here's the good news. Once you understand this mechanism, you can hack it to work in your favor. The key to crossing the finish line isn't forcing yourself through sheer willpower. It's about building psychological closure, training your brain to crave completion as much as it craves starting. This requires understanding how your mind processes unfinished tasks and leveraging that knowledge to create an unstoppable drive toward completion. The Zeigarnik effect, a psychological phenomenon, shows that unfinished tasks create mental tension that can only be released through completion. Your brain actually uses more energy maintaining awareness of incomplete projects than it does finishing them. This is why unfinished tasks nag at you, creating mental clutter that affects your focus and productivity. J.K. Rowling understood this principle when writing the final Harry Potter book. Facing immense pressure and countless distractions, she knew that traditional writing methods wouldn't work. Instead of trying to write in small chunks between other commitments, she booked a room at the Balmoral Hotel in Edinburgh. She removed every possible distraction and created an environment where finishing was the only option. This wasn't just about finding a quiet place to write. It was about creating psychological closure cues that made completion inevitable. By physically removing herself from her normal environment and creating clear boundaries, she transformed finishing from a distant goal into an immediate necessity. The science behind this strategy is fascinating. Research in behavioral psychology shows that your brain responds powerfully to environmental cues. When you create an environment that signals completion, your neural pathways begin to align with that outcome. This is why deadlines, while sometimes stressful, can be incredibly effective. They create a clear endpoint that your brain can lock onto. But here's what most people get wrong about finishing. They try to tackle the entire remaining portion of a project at once. This triggers overwhelm, leading to procrastination and, ultimately, abandonment. The key is to break the finishing process into small, visible victories that your brain can celebrate. Think of it like climbing a mountain. The summit might seem impossibly far when you're halfway up, but if you focus on reaching the next ridge, then the next, suddenly the peak becomes attainable. Each mini-completion releases dopamine, creating a positive feedback loop that drives you toward the final goal. Marco, a startup founder in Seattle, always found himself leaving projects 90% complete. He had a graveyard of almost finished initiatives that were just waiting for the final touches. Sound familiar? His breakthrough came when he implemented what he called his finishing system. Instead of treating completion as a distant goal, Marco created immediate visibility for unfinished work. He kept open documents on his desktop until they were complete, no hiding them in folders. He set visible countdowns for each project phase and celebrated small completions with tangible rewards. Most importantly, he made unfinished work uncomfortable. This last point is crucial. Your brain naturally seeks comfort, which is why it's easy to let projects linger in an almost done state. By making incomplete tasks visibly annoying, whether through desktop clutter, calendar reminders, or public commitments, you flip the comfort equation. Suddenly, finishing becomes more appealing than leaving things undone. Marco's system worked because it aligned with how our brains naturally process tasks and rewards. He didn't try to force completion through willpower alone. Instead, he created an environment where finishing became the path of least resistance. The key components of his system were visual progress tracking. He used a simple board where unfinished tasks were prominently displayed, making progress, or lack thereof, impossible to ignore. Mini deadlines. Instead of one big deadline, he created multiple small deadlines, each with its own celebration point. Public accountability. He shared his completion dates with his team, making finishing a matter of public record. Completion rewards. Each finished project earned him a specific reward, but only upon full completion, no partial credit. Within months, Marco's completion rate soared. Projects that would have lingered at 90% were getting finished, because the psychological cost of leaving them incomplete became higher than the effort required to finish them. This approach works because it addresses both the psychological and practical aspects of completion. It's not enough to just want to finish. You need systems that make finishing inevitable. The power of this strategy lies in its ability to transform how your brain perceives completion. Instead of seeing finishing as a draining process that requires massive willpower, you begin to view it as a series of satisfying closures, each bringing its own reward. Think about a project you're currently leaving unfinished. What's really stopping you from completing it? Often, it's not the actual work required. It's the mental barrier of perceiving the remaining tasks as one big, overwhelming chunk. Your challenge today is to identify one unfinished project and create a visual deadline for it. This isn't about setting another vague goal. It's about making completion tangible and unavoidable. Set a public completion date that others know about. Put a visible reminder somewhere you can't ignore. Create a physical or digital space where the unfinished work is constantly visible. Define what done looks like in specific, measurable terms. Establish a concrete reward that you'll only get upon full completion. Remember, finishing isn't about perfection. It's about closure. The goal isn't to create something flawless. It's to complete something meaningful. When you shift your focus from perfection to completion, you unlock a new level of productivity and satisfaction. Chapter 15. Making Action, Your Default Mode. Imagine a version of yourself who takes action without hesitation. No more overthinking. No more waiting for motivation. No more unfinished projects. This isn't a fantasy. It's who you become when you stop letting procrastination control you. The final step in your transformation is making relentless action your default mode. Your brain is currently wired for hesitation. Every time you delay, overthink, or wait for the perfect moment, you strengthen neural pathways that make procrastination your go-to response. But here's what most people don't realize. These pathways can be rewired. Just as your brain learned to procrastinate, it can learn to take immediate action. The difference between those who succeed and those who don't isn't talent or luck. It's their ability to stay in motion. They don't stop when they're tired, uninspired, or uncertain. This isn't about motivation or willpower. It's about rewiring your default response to challenges. Angela Duckworth's groundbreaking research on grit revealed something fascinating. Perseverance beats natural ability every time. She studied West Point cadets, national spelling bee champions, and successful entrepreneurs, finding that their success wasn't determined by talent or intelligence. Instead, it was their ability to maintain consistent action despite obstacles, setbacks, and periods of low motivation. The world's top performers don't rely on fleeting motivation. They execute regardless of circumstances. They've trained their brains to bypass the decision-making process that typically leads to procrastination. When faced with a task, they don't debate whether to do it. They simply begin. This automatic execution isn't something they were born with. It's a learned response, developed through intentional practice and specific mental frameworks. By understanding and applying these frameworks, you can build the same execution mindset that drives high achievers. The key is creating what psychologists call implementation intentions, specific triggers that automatically lead to action. These aren't vague goals or aspirations. They're concrete if-then statements that bypass your brain's natural tendency to hesitate. Nia, a graphic designer in Portland, used to be paralyzed by self-doubt. Every project became an internal battle between action and avoidance. Her breakthrough came when she adopted a simple but powerful rule. If an action takes less than 10 seconds to start, she does it immediately. No exceptions. At first, this rule felt mechanical and forced, but as she consistently applied it, something remarkable happened. Her brain began to associate tasks with immediate action rather than hesitation. The mental debate that usually preceded work disappeared. She found herself starting projects automatically, without the internal resistance that had previously held her back. This transformation wasn't just about getting more done. It fundamentally changed how she saw herself. Instead of identifying as someone who struggles with procrastination, she became someone who takes immediate action. The shift in identity reinforced her new behavior, creating a positive feedback loop that made execution increasingly effortless. What made Nia's approach so effective was its simplicity. She didn't try to overhaul her entire personality or force herself to become a different person overnight. Instead, she created a clear, specific trigger that her brain could latch onto. The 10-second rule eliminated the gray area where procrastination typically thrives. Like Nia, you can rewire your brain's response to tasks by establishing your own execution rule. This isn't about setting goals or making vague commitments to do better. It's about creating a non-negotiable standard that automatically triggers action. Your rule should be simple enough to remember in any situation, specific enough to eliminate decision-making, challenging enough to create growth, realistic enough to maintain consistently. The power of this approach lies in its ability to bypass your brain's natural resistance to effort. When you have a clear, predefined response to tasks, you eliminate the mental negotiation that usually leads to procrastination. Conclusion: the journey you've undertaken isn't just about beating procrastination. It's about becoming someone new. Through each chapter, you've systematically dismantled the mental blocks that kept you trapped in cycles of avoidance and delay. You've learned that motivation is unreliable, that perfectionism is just fear in disguise, and that your brain's resistance to action can be outsmarted with the right strategies. But knowledge alone isn't enough. The real transformation happens in the daily decisions you make from this moment forward. Each time you choose action over avoidance, you're not just completing a task, you're reinforcing your new identity as someone who executes without hesitation. The path ahead will have obstacles. There will be days when the old patterns try to resurface, when the voice of procrastination whispers that you can do it later. But now you know better. You understand that later is a lie, that waiting only strengthens the habits you're working to break. Think about how far you've come. You started this journey believing you were just a procrastinator. Now you understand that procrastination was never about laziness or lack of discipline. It was about fear, uncertainty, and ingrained patterns that you've now learned to override. Your transformation isn't about perfection. It's about progress. There will be moments when you slip back into old patterns. But now you have something you didn't have before: awareness and tools. You can catch yourself faster, course correct sooner, and get back on track without the spiral of guilt and self-doubt that used to derail you completely. This is what separates those who create lasting change from those who remain stuck. It's not about never falling. It's about how quickly you get back up. Each time you reset and return to action, you're not starting over. You're starting from a stronger foundation. Your new life as an action taker starts now. Not tomorrow, not when you feel ready, not when conditions are perfect. Now. Every moment is an opportunity to reinforce your new identity through decisive action. The only question that matters is, what will you do with this moment? Thank you for listening and for investing in yourself. I believe in you. Your potential is endless. Now go out there and create the life you deserve.